So we've been spending the last few weeks, and we will spend this and next week, talking about some of the possible theological implications of the final report from the Ferguson Commission. What does it mean? How do we put feet and prayers and our energy as a people of faith behind what we now know of the injustices? We've known them for a long time, but now you can point to the statistics and say, you can't dismiss them now. So one of the things we have to do on a regular basis over these few weeks is to talk a lot about public policy. And the thing about public policy that we have to keep in mind always is that when it comes to the way cities and municipalities work, is that there is never anything magical about it. Things don't just happen. Land doesn't just become available. Neighborhoods don't just fall apart by accident. Grand visions of public housings don't come crumbling down because, well, the people there messed it up. We stop funding them. And that's why Pruitt-Igoe ceased to work. That's the way it's always worked. There is no magic in public policy. When an area thrives, it's because of good planning. And when an area falls, it's also as a result of planning. Sometimes, while accidental, but it is never, ever magic. The current situation that exists around us is because of politicians and civic leaders. And maybe someone said, well, that's just because you grew up in Indianapolis and it happened to work there. I grew up in a city where they figured out how to do public-private partnerships, and it was under the leadership of the former minister of my church, so I'm probably a little bit jaded in thinking that cities can actually work. So I've come to believe, and you can dismiss this, but when cities don't work, it is as a result of planning, even if the intended consequences were not what we expected. But the reason I mention this is that the good news in all of this is that if we created it, we can change it. We can never sit back and go, well, there's really nothing we can do about it. It's just the way things are. Things just happen that way. I think the prophet Amos understood this well when he presented the indictment of God on the leadership of Israel. Because what we know of that time was that the people of Israel, the leadership of Israel, had come to believe that the mess that they lived in was just the way it was. There was nothing they could do about it. So when poor people were selling themselves into slavery for silver because they were broke, it was a system that people just assumed was what was supposed to happen. In a system, it became acceptable for human beings, imagine this for a minute, for human beings to be traded as commodities. I know it's hard to imagine. Or even for a pair of sandals. You might have heard that the Nike workers in Vietnam went on strike this past week. The new Jordans came out and they weren't happy about it because they're making nickels while we spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on tennis shoes. Selling the poor for a pair of sandals, maybe today we might say for a pair of Jordans. Or maybe I'm stretching that too far. You can decide. In this type of system that existed, the poor are seen as expendable. And the people who are in need, this is Israel now, you can make your own connections to where we are today, but the poor and the afflicted who needed care are pushed out of the way. When I was in Atlanta, it was after the Olympics. And one of my seminary classmates had been an attorney for 30 years, and she was part of the class action lawsuit against the city of Atlanta, and they rounded up homeless people, gave them one-way tickets to Birmingham, Alabama, put them on the Greyhound bus and sent them out of town. And if that didn't work, they rounded them up and put them in prison until the Olympics were over, because, well, we had to present a pretty picture of the city of Atlanta, always the city too busy to hate. Someone said the city too busy to really care. I'm editing there. Whenever the poor and people who are afflicted are seen as expendable, they always seem to get pushed out of the way for new development, or what we now call gentrification, or something like that. I know you have to take a moment and try to imagine a system like this that existed. It's the thing we were talking about. We're still talking about Israel now, I think. What we found is in the Ferguson Commission's final report, report, this third signature priority paints a picture of a society just like this. Not one-to-one, but very clearly where some folks are getting pushed aside. The title of the third signature priority was this opportunity to thrive. We have a hard time even imagining justice. So talking about opportunity to thrive, what in the world are we talking about? Well, they have three areas that they talk about. Health. In order to thrive, you have to have access to good health care. You have to have health in order to have a thriving life. You have to have employment, and this is the piece that we often forget, wealth creation. So that we don't have to take care of other people, but that we can teach them and provide them the resources available to create wealth on their own. And the picture that was painted in this report of our region is not good. We've come to accept that now, right? Every time we talk about something, we can say, in this report, St. Louis is failing. The sad part of the reality, though, is that we've known this stuff longer than we've been talking about Ferguson. We know the city doesn't work. We know the things that need to happen, and we also know well enough. And I've heard from some of you who've been involved in city planning who said it's just never going to happen because of these politicians don't want it to work this way or these particular business interests. Well, today we have some things to say about that, I think. The truth is, public policy created it, and public policy can impact the change, but not by itself. Let me point out just a few of the ways in which we, and I say we because we live in this city, this metropolitan region, the ways in which we are taking the poor and cramming their face into dust, to take the language of Amos. You know, Missouri refused to expand Medicare, and I know that's a political issue, so I shouldn't talk about it, but let me say this, that if you make over $2,900 a year, $2,900 a year, that's $2,900 a year, and you don't have children, you don't qualify for Medicare. But if you've got children, you then qualify. And the state of Missouri refused to expand Medicare because with the Obamacare plan, the idea was that you were going to expand Medicare for folks above $2,900 up to about $32,000, right? Those for a family of four. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds here, but there's this wide swath of people who can't get coverage because Missouri, along with 18 other states, have no interest in expanding Medicare. Now, here's the interesting thing, and this is the part that's probably going to bother you, but once you got to that 32 and above threshold, you could then, as you know, buy into the marketplace. And that's still, you would get subsidies if you made above that. But see, in Missouri, we've refused to cover these folks, so there's no subsidies for the folks in here to even buy into the market. It gets worse, get this. So, if you've got a family of four making $32,000 a year, there's no money for them to buy health insurance if they're not covered by their employer. However, if you're a family of four making $95,000 a year, you get a federal subsidy to buy into the marketplace. That's not right. It's not political. It's about grinding the face of those most needy in the dirt. But that's just one example. So when we talk about opportunity to thrive, we got to get our justice straight first. Another example is on economic mobility. When they use that language, what they mean is that for one generation to do better than their parents had done. This was about wealth creation, but also about opportunities for our children that we may not have had ourselves. And it's a great idea. Missouri, how have they done? Well, we ranked 42nd out of 50. We're in the bottom. It's bad. In St. Louis, and we know these numbers, the deep disparity between just black and white folk. On issues of unemployment, income, and rates of home ownership should embarrass us. The numbers are often twice the size for black folk than they are for white folk. The system of public policy created a system where, in the black community, the unemployment rate is officially 18%. Now, the thing we know about unemployment rates is they're always lower than they actually are. But 18% unemployment, and 6% for white folks. Now, if you know anything about economic policy, that 6% almost represents what we would call full employment. I'm not going to get into that, but basically we have a system that says it's acceptable for 6% of the white population to be unemployed and 18% of the black population to be unemployed. That is what we call full employment. Public policy not only creates an underclass, but then punishes them for being poor. We've talked about that. And yet, in our state, in our city, and even in our churches, to talk about such things often will bring up blank stares, cynical resignation, or outright hostility. Because these are not issues of faith. Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is, we will stand under the judgment of God for our refusal to deal with basic fairness, let alone some justice, and even opportunities to thrive. In order to go from an environment where people are being sold for a pair of sandals to a place where people can thrive, we need more than just changes in public policy. We need changes of the heart. But don't get me wrong, we need changes in policy as well. You can change all the hearts you want. You can have all the legislatures in the state of Missouri going to church on Sunday, but when they go to work on Monday, they grind the faces of the poor in the dirt without losing sleep. We, as people of faith, have to believe what we cannot yet see. When we start digging down into the mess that we're aware of, but until we start scraping and finding what's really going on, it is easy to fall into despair, but we cannot. And that is where, in the story, Abram comes in and speaks us a word of truth. Probably wondering, I read that and you're going, how is he going to fit that into this? We'll see if this works. So lo and behold, Abram is received a vision from God. And he says, I know you've given us this promise. This isn't the first time Abram hears that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars and that they will be a blessing to the earth, right? And Abraham goes, okay, I get that. I'm old, but I get that. And my wife can't have kids, but I get that. I'm going to trust and believe. And we even have that in there, right? The thing he says is, okay, I'll trust and believe, but you know that I don't have any kids, and so it's going to go to this guy over here? And God says, no. I told you this is the way that it's going. Trust me, follow, I'll take care of the details. Now, we all know that Abram doesn't trust them, eventually tries to figure it out on his own, as we do. And lo and behold, even after trusting and being called righteous, he turns around and goes, now how is this supposed to happen again? Now, here's why I think this is prevalent. I think this is connected. Abram simply cannot believe it. Look around, Lord, right, as we might pray. You've seen the current state of our political system. You can't really believe that our work for justice is going to make any difference. How about we just settle for what we can get? After all, let us be pragmatic. But that's not our calling. Our calling is to continue to work and struggle for justice, no matter, even if it seems like our efforts are going backwards. Not settle, take what we can get, and keep moving forward. God says, trust. Keep on the path. and do not lose heart. Your particular struggle for justice is part of a large fabric of people who are trying to cover the injustices and do away with them. So in this section of Opportunity to Thrive, and I promise that I'm not going to get down in the weeds because this is the section that if you are tired, you don't want to read. Because it is deep, and it is deep in policy, and it is powerful. So here are the things that they talk about. I'm just going to touch on them just so that you know. The first one is, and this is really powerful, the title of it was Ending Poverty. Now, for years, we've been talking about poverty in the public arena, and what we've said is we want to basically lessen it. They said, why would we just talk about making it less? Why not ending it? And what would it take to end it? Because if we don't start with a grand vision, you know this is the way this works, right? We set a big goal and say, this is where we're going to go. And you know, like the fast food workers campaign that we were part of help kicking off the ground, right? In the city of St. Louis, I know it's gotten rescinded, but the ask was 15. And they walked out with 11 and hopes for 13. What if they had asked for 11? They might have walked out with 755, right? That's the point. So work for the ending of poverty and you might get there, but if you work for the eradication, you're not, or for the lessening of it, you're not even going to get halfway there. And then the other one was, and here's one that I'm going to ask for your participation if you're willing. If you've already read the report, you know, don't answer. Do you know what, and this was a study that was done from University of Missouri, St. Louis. What was the number one issue that was an impediment? The prime issue that was the impediment for getting out of poverty. What is the one issue that they identified? Anybody know? Not if you read the report, no, don't answer it. Take a guess.
Education.
Education, wrong, but thank you. That's what I said. That was actually...
Transportation?
Yes! The issue was access to transportation. And it was directly related to the amount of commute time it takes to get to work. If you can't get to work on time, what does your boss tell you? Well, you need to be professional. The problem with that is our bus system in this city doesn't work. If you ride it on a regular basis, you know. They don't always come when they're scheduled. And 78% of our riders happen to be black. If we want to increase, and here's the interesting thing, part of this study, that if the city of St. Louis, the metropolitan area, addressed all of these areas, and I'm going to talk about them in a minute, just on wages, and this is where we're going in a minute, just on wages and transportation, that the city of St. Louis in 2014 would have had an additional $14 billion of revenue pumped into the city. We wouldn't have had to go to the state. We could have built that stadium and spent all the money there. It pays, and this is the fascinating thing, right? Yes, it's an issue of justice. Yes, this is what the Bible calls us to. And it's also not bad economic policy. But the things I want to point out real quickly in this report, then I'm going to go forward because you all get most of these things. But the one that I thought was particularly important was focusing on building assets. Helping people understand the way that generational wealth is built. How do you have access? So when people go to cash their payroll check, they're paying 5% just to get it cashed. Or if you get your government assistance check, you're paying 4 or 5% right off the top. Now that might not seem a lot. However, if you're already scraping to get by, every single percent will make a difference. If you have a bank account, you don't get charged for cashing your check. And so they talk about building ways of creating investment communities in underserved communities. Not so that we just simply provide Medicaid, not so that we just simply provide, as we talked about last week, food. It's not just providing for the basic needs, but starting there and then building a system where people do not need someone else to provide for them. If we provide the infrastructure, if we create a system of incentive-based training, if we have a populace that has access to good public transportation and can get to and from various jobs, all of a sudden they don't need anyone else. Is what everybody wants, the opportunity to thrive. When I lived in Northern Ireland, the neighborhood where I lived had 70% unemployment. But at the time, Britain had one of the best social security nets that existed in the Western world. So that meant that young men who I got to meet, while not having a job, were getting paid. They had access to good housing. They had access to some of the best public transportation that existed in Western Europe, which should be an embarrassment, by the way, to our public transportation. They had access to job training. They had access to health care without paying for it. I got sick when I was there, and I kept saying, well, who do I pay? And they looked like I was crazy. They're like, you're here on a visa. This is the way the system works. You don't pay for it. That's what we do with our taxes. And it works. It was great medical care, by the way. And lo and behold, though, despite having all of these things, repeatedly, what I heard from some of the young men was, this is great, but I'd really like to have a job. I want a purpose. So it's not just about providing basic needs. It's providing communities and systems and opportunities for people to have something more. Opportunity to thrive. We've got a long way to go just to stop grinding people's face in the dirt. But the vision has to be thriving. Because if all we're worried about is stop grinding faces in the dirt, we're not even getting there. When I read this section, Opportunity to Thrive, I have to admit that I did not feel particularly hopeful given our political climate. There were things in there that I looked at and I thought, well, I'm not sure I agree necessarily with the nuance of what's going on there, but again, this is above my pay grade. But the idea is to get us into the conversation. But as we enter the conversation, we don't go in as policy analysts, we don't go in as experts, we go in as people of the empty tomb. What do I mean? We are people who know that death does not have the last word. We also know that death will come knocking on all of our doors, and yet we get up, we keep working, we keep struggling, we keep building community, and we keep acknowledging that justice is to come down like rushing waters. We go on struggling not as fools, but as the true hopers of the world. We know the end of the story, even if we don't always know the path right in front of us. We know where we are headed. And so we have to keep raising throughout this the banner of hope and justice and pointing out that the mess of our time was created by human beings, and it is human beings who are responsible for fixing it. Not someone else, but all of us collectively, using our gifts and talents to begin to create a thriving, healthy community. It will take us all.